I must tell you of my sorrow that I feel deep in the marrow of my bones. I have been alive for more than 10 years, and during all that time, because of my low-born status, I have had to regard my father and older brother as my owners rather than relatives. Not once was I allowed to address my father as father, and my older brother as brother. So how could I not be filled with grief? Such is the lament of Hong Gildong, the illegitimate son of a high-ranking minister in Korea during the Joseon dynasty. A lament which he delivers after having survived an assassination attempt orchestrated by the senior concubine of his father's house. Even at just 10 years old, though, Hong Gildong possesses such tremendous skill and knowledge that he is never in any real danger, even from a hired killer. Rather than showcasing a tense scene of peril, the incident highlights how that tremendous skill represents wasted potential, as his position as an illegitimate son means that Hong Gildong will never be afforded the opportunity to take the examinations that would allow him to secure his own position of influence and authority. As the societally accepted forms of advancement are closed off to him, the young Hong Gildong must reach manhood by forging his own destiny outside the structures of polite society. He does this by leading a band of outlaws that come to be known as Hwalbindang, which can be translated to mean a league of those who help the impoverished. Welcome to the Greenwood. I'm your host, Thaddeus Papke, and this is the podcast where we peek under the hood of the most famous outlaw who may have never been. And for this episode, the legendary outlaw in question doesn't come from medieval England, but from Korea during the Joseon dynasty. When exactly during the Joseon dynasty? A period that lasted from 1392 to 1897? Well, as we'll hear from this week's guest, most likely a great deal later than most people have thought. I sat down with Dr. Minsoo Kang, professor of history at the University of Missouri, and the translator of the Story of Hong Gildong, which is available from Penguin Classics, to discuss the disputed authorship of the Story of Hong Gildong, how it eventually became an unparalleled success, the ways in which the so-called Robin Hood of Korea has some distinct differences from his English counterpart, and a great deal more. So, string your bow, form your own Hwalbindang, and come with us as we enter the Greenwood with author and scholar Dr. Minsoo Kang.
Hello.
Oh, hello. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining me.
Good. You're very welcome.
Yeah, so thank you so much for this. I'm really excited. It's a little bit different than anything I've done before on the podcast, but I've really been kind of wanting to branch out a little bit. So I just recently, got myself a copy of your translation of the Story of Hong Gildong, and was hoping that you could talk with me about it. Like I said in our email, kind of one of the things I was really hoping we could talk about is sort of what makes the story very distinctly Korean. It has these elements that lead to it being compared to Robin Hood, but really it is so much different than that. It's really like that does it a disservice to just say, oh, it's Robin Hood, but in Korea. And so that's kind of the heart of what I was really hoping we could do today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's open. Oh, by the way, I just want to tell you, because of the complexity of the issues involved, I ended up writing an entire book about the story of Hong Gildong and its history and its comparison with Robin Hood and other stories. So a lot of the things that I'll be able to tell you it has been published in this book.
Okay, great. And where can one get the book? That
Oh,
book?
it's from University of Hawaii Press, so it's available online and everything.
Okay, I'll make sure that I find that and include some links to that in the show notes.
Oh, that would be awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, so how about we just start with a little bit of an introduction of who you are and kind of your personal relationship with the story of Hong Gildong.
Sure. I'm Minsoo Kang. I'm a history professor at the University of Missouri in St. Louis. And my actual field of expertise is in European history. And because that was what my doctorate from UCLA was on. And so, interesting enough, in that field, one of the more recent interests within European history is the study of medievalisms, which is different from the study of Middle Ages, because that actually studies the Middle Ages. But medievalism is a relatively new field that has been created to study what different ages have thought about the Middle Ages and how they conceptualize the Middle Ages in different time periods. Like, for instance, we know there was a great deal of interest on the Middle Ages during the early Romantic period in the 19th century, right? Mm-hmm. And that's when also there was a huge interest in Robin Hood stories and all that. And also, I'm looking into a type of new form of medievalism that was created in the 1930s as a reaction to a kind of a negative reaction to all things modernity that occurred in the 20th century. And one of the things that 20th century, 1930s medievalism created was the modern fantasy novel, including Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and so on, right? Anyway, so in terms of my connection with Hong Gildong, I'm Korean, and if you're Korean, you know who Hong Gildong is, right? I mean, he's such a household name, right? I mean, if you ever meet somebody who claims to be Korean and you have some doubt as to whether that person is really Korean, ask them if they know who Hong Gildong is, right? If they don't, it's not right. So he's not only as much of a household name and person as Robin Hood is in England, and his story has been filmed countless times in TV, movies. When Korean kids grow up, they grow up like reading at least for my generation, reading Hong Gildong comic books. The very first Korean animated film ever made in Korea was a Hong Gildong movie. And so on and so on. So there's no getting away from Hong Gildong. Everybody knows who Hong Gildong is, what his story is, and everybody even knows his famous lament that because he's an illegitimate son, he cannot even address his father as father. He cannot even address his older brother as brother, right? I mean, that's his big lament, right? Now, how I came to this is a funny story. I mean, I knew even as an undergrad that I was going to go into European history, and that's a whole another thing because I spent much of my early childhood in Europe because my father was a diplomat for the Korean government. So I lived in Austria for a while. But I took a class on an introduction to cultural history. And for anybody who's interested in both Robin Hood and Hong Gildong in a larger universal context, they need to read this book called Bandits by Eric Hobsbawm, which was one of the books that I read in the class, right? And Eric Hobsbawm was one of the great historians of the 20th century. I mean, he's mainly famous for his groundbreaking works that he's written on 19th century nationalism. But he wrote this quirky little book called Bandits, which is my personal favorite of his, right? And one of the things that really astounding thing that he shows is that the figure of an outlaw, he's definitely a criminal because he's committing, acts that goes against the established laws of the land. Right. But at the same time, he's regarded as a hero for various different reasons, especially by the common people. So the authorities may be out to get him because he's a criminal, but the common people love him, right? So when I describe it like that, immediately most people in the West are thinking, oh, Robin Hood, right? In Korea, they're thinking of Hong Gildong, right? Now, the astounding thing about this book is that he shows that same guy appears pretty much everywhere in the world. right? You could go to any major region of the world, and they have a local variant of the heroic outlaw, right?
Right.
So, and in the book, he shows an East African version of this guy, a Chinese version of the guy, a Latin American version of the guy, and so he's what would be called. I don't have. I'm not a huge fan of sort of Jungian archetypes and all that, but
Right.
he's exactly what Joseph Campbell would have called a hero with 1,000 faces.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I read that book, I was like, I mean, being a Korean in an American university, I was like, this guy's not only Robin Hood, it's Hong Gildong. Hong Gildong's not mentioned in the book. Apparently, Hobson didn't know about him. So I decided to write my final paper on that in that class about applying Eric Hobsbawm's description of the noble outlaw, using Hong Gildong. But I looked for a English translation of the story of Hong Gildong, which did exist at the time, but it was kind of terrible. And it was really short. It had a feel of a truncated text, like there were scenes that were seemed to be missing and all that. I later found out why. It's because there isn't one, but dozens of different variants. And I also found out that during the Joseon Dynasty Korea, when a novel becomes successful, because there was no copyright laws at the time, any publisher could reprint it. Right. But a lot of them ended up printing shorter version of it to save money on paper.
Mm-hmm.
Right, which is kind of hilarious, right?
And if it has all the same broad strokes, it's just going to look like the same paper, and people aren't the same story, and so people aren't going to know. Yeah,
and there are episodes missing, and so on and so on, right? And so I mean, for literary scholars, this is one good thing about this is that this tells us which is the closest to the Ur text. Mm-hmm. Right, because the longest one tend to be the oldest one, right? And the shortest one tend to be the later one. And what I learned much later on, was that the translator really picked one of the shorter texts, and I was really unhappy with it. So in the back of my mind, I was like, you know what? One day I'm going to take on a new translation, right? I mean, see if there's a good text. Now, more years than I care to recount, past, right? Because I went on to do my doctorate and all that. I didn't really have time to take on a project that's completely divorced from what I was working on. So it wasn't until
not a quick, easy thing. Yeah,
exactly, right. It wasn't until I got tenure that all my academic friends were like, look, right after you finish tenure, you get tenure for your next project, do something fun, right? And because you reward yourself. I mean, you still have to be productive, but you reward yourself by doing something that you kind of want to. So I decided to do that, and I suddenly remembered this promise that I made to myself so long ago, that I'm going to look at Hong Gildong. And so I looked at it, and I found out that, as a matter of fact, as I told you, there are variations of the text that are older, longer, more complete, better descriptions, and so on. So I picked the one that's there's kind of agreement among scholars that this is the oldest one, and then I ended up translating it. And what was fortuitous for me was that originally it was published in an academic journal that specializes in Korean literature. But then, out of nowhere, I get contacted by the editor at the Penguin Classics series, and he tells me that he realized that they have never. I mean, it's kind of shocking, but they've never done a Penguin Classic of a work that's been translated from English. From Korean.
From Korean,
right? And he read my translation, and he said, we would like this to be, the first. And I was like, okay, let's do it, right? Yeah. But then I have to say, this is, as a long-term resident of a Korean who's also a long-term resident of the United States, the thing that just completely took me by surprise, I don't get it at all, is, I mean, I get it, but I don't quite have a good understanding of it, as the explosive popularity of South Korean popular culture in the West, which just took me completely by surprise. I mean, I don't listen to K-pop, mainly because I'm too old for it. I don't really watch a lot of K-dramas and so on. But my translation happened to come out right at the time when the so-called cave wave just hit America. And so the sales were astounding. I mean, as an academic, I don't expect to get nice royalty checks like this every year, right? But I'd say, I mean, it's like, I didn't do it for the money. I didn't, but I'm just really gratified and happy that this I think it's a wonderful story from my country is being known in the West. It's being assigned into pretty much every class that they teach on Korean literature, world literature, and so on. And I'm just really glad that happened, right? But as I said,
it only got onto my radar because of an NPR interview.
Oh, right, yeah. I mean, just the fact that I did an NPR interview, they were interested in doing that. But as I said, while doing the research, I want to do due diligence, and so I read up on all the most recent scholarship on this novel, and I was shocked to find out that almost everything that the vast majority of Koreans think that they know about the history of the novel is all wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
I thought that was
most
fascinating. Yeah. You opened the introduction with that. Yeah.
Right. I mean, most Koreans still think that it was written in the 17th century by this statesman named Hogyun, and they think that its theme and all that. But recent scholars have completely debunked that in all probability it was written by some anonymous commoner writer sometime in the 19th century. And this is a work of entertainment. It's not a work that's supposed to carry deep philosophical or political meaning. So in order to explore, I mean, those ideas were so complicated and interesting. I was also making some minor discoveries of my own. That's why I felt the need to write a whole new book, a whole new academic book detailing all of that in addition to the translation.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's fascinating. As you said, kind of that conventional wisdom that the whole book was written 200 years before it was actually written, that there's this known figure, this statesman and poet who lived in the late 1500s, early 1600s. He's known to be the author of this work. And now the modern scholarship's no, not this guy never, he didn't write this story. He wouldn't have known this story because it didn't exist for him.
Right, exactly. And the thing is, I mean, all that happened because of one quotation. One of Hogyun's students who he made a comment that said that Hogyun wrote a work called The Story of Hong Gildong. And unfortunately for future scholarship, that guy, his name is Ishek, he became one of the most prominent literary figures in Joseon Dynasty. So, if you're an intellectual, everybody read his work. So him saying that Hogyun wrote The Story of Hong Gildong just became sort of commonplace knowledge. The problem is that Hogyun may have written a work called The Story of Hong Gildong, but there's just absolutely no evidence that a 17th century work of that nature had anything to do with the work that we have now.
Right.
Because if you examine The Story of Hong Gildong with a clear eye, it is so obviously an example of the kind of popular fiction that was written in the vernacular Hangul script rather than classic Chinese, which is what the nobility used. Right? The nobility wrote in classic Chinese, but for commoners they wrote in the vernacular script. And if you compare that with other kinds of writings that came out in the 19th century, it fits right in there. So it's just so obvious that it's a 19th century work.
Yeah, the literary analysis just makes it abundantly clear, right?
Yeah.
Now, there is some legal record of an individual named Hong Gildong that was arrested in around the year 1500 or so, right? But that's one of those areas that seems very Robin Hood-like in that, oh yes, you could find a record from the early 13th century of somebody named Rob Hood who was arrested, but there's no link between that one real person who existed and the stories at all, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so Hong Gildong is real. In fact, he's known as the three great outlaws of the Joseon Dynasty. There were three of these figures who were notorious. Of the three, there is official government record of two of them being arrested. And this guy named Hong Gildong was arrested in the year 1500, but I managed to find every single mention of Hong Gildong in the official records. And it is unfortunate because we don't, I mean, it doesn't reveal anything about who he was and what motivated him, all that. But interesting enough, what we do know is that he caused massive damage and caused a great deal of suffering to a lot of people. So that even decades down the line, there were areas that have been devastated by the actions of this guy. So here's an interesting thing. So in all likelihood, the original Hong Gildong that is based on was probably a great villain who caused a wide, spread disruption to the common people. So the question is, what process is in place that a villain like that gets turned into a hero?
Yeah.
Probably several centuries later. And but there's just not enough evidence that one could point to that could give us a clue as to how that exactly happened.
And in the story, that was written hundreds of years later, not only is he a very heroic figure and a very sympathetic figure, but he's also a fantastical figure. And that's something that I wasn't quite prepared for going into it, and probably a lot of other readers, especially if they're just thinking of oh yeah, Korean Robin Hood, they're not going to be ready for how utterly fantastical it is. It is a work of fantasy adventure as much as politics and outlawry.
Right. Yes, he is fantastically strong, and he is portrayed as a great fighter, but mainly his weapon of choice is magic.
Yes, he is a
dude flies around.
Yes,
and he causes storms.
Creates and magical copies of himself and all kinds of
that's a famous one, and creates illusions to confuse his enemies and so on, right? And it's interesting. He gets all of that not from the cliche of having an old master, but he gets it all from reading, from studying.
Self-taught, yeah. Yeah, it was a very, very interesting work in that way. So it does have that the way in which it has the Robin Hood element is because he does go become a leader of a band of outlaws, and they have that sort of specific mission of, we are going to steal from corrupt officials and help common folk, and they make that their mission. And so that's where that noble bandit comes in. But then, unlike a lot of noble bandit stories, he goes and becomes a king. He goes on to do more than just banditry.
I mean, that is precisely why I'm resistant to the idea that this is somehow a work of political or social criticism, right? I mean, two of the ways in which they've described in there. One is that it's a kind of a protest literature against what Joseon Dynasty laws concerning illegitimate children. Right? I mean, it does begin that way. I mean, because the illegitimate children of noblemen and commoner women, I mean, they were in a very bad situation, right? Because there was very limited things that they could do and so on, right? And there were lots of them, right? Because although there were only one legitimate wife was allowed per nobleman, they did have concubines, and then they have children by them. And the other one was that by the way, one of the most bizarre things, modern adaptation, is that the North Koreans made a Hong Gildong movie that you can totally watch on YouTube. The whole thing is on YouTube. And you see a specific Marxist interpretation of Hong Gildong as a anti-feudal story, right? About a fighter against the inequities of the old Joseon Dynasty order, right? But I'm completely skeptical about that kind of ideological reading because, I mean, one of the things that deeply annoy me is when even scholars describe the story of Hong Gildong in that way, that this is sort of an anti-feudal, social criticism novel. They say that, and then he goes off and creates his own land, which is some kind of egalitarian utopia. No, it isn't. It is not an egalitarian utopia. He just recreates Joseon Dynasty monarchy with himself as an absolute monarch, right?
Yeah, with a single wife and concubines. Yeah,
exactly. And he seemed to have completely I mean, there's not even a single word, single scene where he said, "Well, in my kingdom, people are not going to be discriminated against because they're legitimate," right? Nothing. He's just completely forgotten about it, right?
He even sends a thank you note to the king of the Joseon dynasty.
Yeah, exactly, right. And the thing is, I mean, I don't know about you, but I think one of the things I think kind of funny and also kind of like about Hong Gildong is that he's a supremely egotistical person. And every turn is like, look what I did. I also, and so on. And and he said at one point, when his men sort of questioned his strategy, he said something, ha ha ha, you're like childlike in your inability to comprehend my genius, or something like that, right? And so the thing is, I mean, I think even his lament in the beginning about what it's like for him to be an illegitimate child, it wasn't really about how he's thinking there are these unfair laws in the land, right? That needs to be changed, because he doesn't try to change, right? What it is that I am a person of such superior abilities, right? Me, right? But because I happen to be born an illegitimate child, I can't work for the government. I can't join the military. I can't do anything with it. So I can't do anything for the country with all this super abundant talents and skills that I have. And so I have no choice but to become this leader of a bandit. But once he gets a chance to go forth and becomes a king on his own right, that's what he does, and he becomes king. He doesn't create a democracy. He doesn't create a socialist utopia, right? He creates the sort of standard East Asian Confucian kingdom at its best, when it's working at its best,
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point. And I think that is a very strong through line throughout the book in terms of how much there is that egotistical, he knows best, so he's going to just do the thing that raises him to the next level. And that's really what the book is about, is him ascending from one higher level to another higher level, to getting more power, getting more authority, because he is so talented. He just had to work outside the system because of the law. But as you say, he doesn't change the law. It is a very powerful lament, that whole, I can't call my father, I can't call my brother. And that was one of the things that really struck me. I thought there was a really nice, powerful bit of emotional weight around the time that his father passes, and his father kind of wishes that he could have acknowledged him. And he becomes so close with his half-brother by the end, even though his half-brother had been complicit in plots to kill him when he was a child.
Right, absolutely.
So it has a lot of emotional weight with that element of family, which is one of the things that really struck me, and one of the ways that I wanted to highlight in terms of how very different it feels from the Robin Hood legends. Sure, there's a few modern adaptations that will make family be an element, but it is nothing. It is not there at all in any of the original stories. And so that's part of what makes this feel very different from those Robin Hood stuff.
Yeah.
But as you say, also, it's about him and his family. It's not about family dynamics for the kingdom as a whole. I think my favorite part of the story was actually the passing of his father and the emotion involved with it. I wanted to ask at some point what kind of your favorite part was, what sort of episodes in the story really stood out for you?
Oh, yeah. So one of the characteristics of these popular fiction that was written at the time is that they tend to have fairly standard three-part structure. Right? And in the case of the story of Hong Gildong, the part one takes place almost entirely in the household of the family. Right? And when part one ends, that's when he leaves the household. Right? Part two is all about his activities as a bandit leader, and that takes place all over the country. And part two ends when he leaves the country, and part three is his adventures abroad, leading battles, becoming a king, and so on. Right. And one of the things I love about this, I can't really pinpoint exactly specific scenes, but there are different. I would say that the different scenes in each of these three parts because from a modern perspective, what we get is increasing levels of fantasy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Right?
he fights monsters by the end.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So part one is mostly realist, and I think for historians, it is of most interest because I think it gives you a very, very accurate picture of what it was like to live in those big compounds where you have several generations of families and its family background, family dynamics, and all of that. So that's solidly in the realm of the real, except him learning magic and and all of that, right?
Yeah, the main villain in the first part is the chief concubine who's jealous.
Right. So you can, it gives you insight of what that must have been like. What is like for, in a household, with a nobleman and various different women and their children and the conflict among them and so on, and sort of this, the battle for influence and so on, right? So, and the second part, it's like half within the realm of the real, because you're still dealing with real occurrences in life, except that now Hong Gildong is fully in charge of his magical skills and so on, right? And then the third part is just pure fantasy.
Right.
That's how it's
epic fantasy writ large. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. So I would say, rather than having one specific scenes that I love that. I love that it's almost like three different novels in one, three different genres of novel in one.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the first part, I am deeply moved when he does have that lament when he tells his father that, I did this so much that I want to do, but I can't, and all
Yeah.
that. That's to me, that's to me just realism. The realism of a person in the position. In the second part, I love that whole vignette. I really love that whole vignette of the chief of the police coming after him in disguise, and just Hong Gildong just messing with him, just messing with him the whole time.
Very trickstery there. That is another like Robin Hood connection. There's a lot of Hong Gildong wearing disguises.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. In the third part, I like the big battle scenes that were really because they're not realistic, they're not reflective of real battles that were fought at the time. But the thing is, it is in one of the battle scenes that I had one of the particular challenges. So the very language of Korean underwent such radical change from the 19th century Joseon dynasty to the modern era that for most modern Koreans, they have really difficult time reading something from the 19th century, right? Look, it's somebody now, even when they pick up Shakespeare, it's kind of difficult. They could get through it, but they do need a good set of footnotes and so on, right?
Yeah.
Except unlike in the West, where literary and historical changes occurred gradually over time, the entrance of modernity in Korea was such a shock and rapid development that the differences in the languages are way more pronounced. So despite the fact that I'm a fluent speaker and reader of Korean, it almost felt like I had to learn an entire language to be able to read and think like a 19th century Korean. And there was kind of one kind of cool thing. Like, for instance, there were certain phrases that people would use, certain proverbs and all of that, not all of which were clear to me because they just didn't. There were things that modern Koreans don't use, right? Now, like for instance, there was one that was that took me a while to figure out. When Hong Gildong goes to this besieges castle, he tells the lord of the castle that you need to surrender right away. Right? If you surrender right away, I'm not going to touch anybody. You'll be fine and all that. But if you keep resisting us, then sooner or later, he says the following: stone and jade will burn alike.
Yeah.
Right? And I was like, what the hell does that mean? Stone and jade will burn alike. And that's not a phrase that exists in modern Korean, right? So I did so much research trying to figure out what that was, and I consulted, scholars and all that until I finally figured it out, right? I finally found a scholar who was able to explain it. So what it meant was that, so stone is an ordinary thing and jade is a very precious object, right? And to say that stone and jade would burn alike, it means that we will destroy everybody, like
The
whether
high and the low, yeah.
commoners or noblemen, right? So everybody will be hurt by this, right? And I just, it's just such a, as a as a scholar, it's just a joy when I'm able to figure even little things out like that.
I have to say, I do really appreciate, as the reader, how much work you put into that, because I just had to read the little note that you put in the end to know what it meant.
Right.
So thank you for that.
Yeah.
What you were saying about that 3-act kind of structure and how common that was does lead into one of the other questions I really wanted to ask, and that's how similar or different the story of Hong Gildong is to other Korean bandit tales, whether it's those ones that it felt like it fit in from the 19th century or from earlier tradition. What kind of DNA does it share with some of those other outlaw tales?
That's a really interesting question, because frankly, I think that's one of the ways in which the story of Hong Gildong is unique, because I cannot think of any work of literature that glorifies a outlaw in Korean. There were outlaws that that were around, and there were outlaws that may have been glorified in the popular imagination, but no, there's not a single work. I know that in the early 19th century there was a major rebellion, but this was not a bandit activity. There was a rebellion, and I know that there's a work in existence, that a fictional work that actually glorifies the rebel, but he's a political rebel. He's not a social rebel social rebel like Hong Gildong is. And so, for instance, I mean, the other two great bandits, real life great bandits of Joseon Dynasty, a guy named Chang Gil-san and another one called Im Gok-jung. And what's interesting is that in the 20th century, a North Korean writer wrote an epic novel about Im Gok-jung, again portraying him as a kind of proto-communist rebel. But the thing is, so stories about them are around, but I think that's one of the really interesting thing about the stories of Hong Gildong, because it's, as you can imagine, that especially in a traditional Confucian state, it would have been a kind of a dangerous thing to glorify a outlaw,
right?
Especially in a novel like this, where he not only humiliates and outwits authority figures, he does it to the king. I mean, he pretends to be captured, then he's like, nah.
Yeah.
And so on. And he claims to show respect to the king, but at the end of the day, he does what he likes, Right. His way of showing respect to the king and say, okay, now you did the thing for me where you appointed me as the minister of war, so I'm going to do you a favor and leave, so that you don't have to have the embarrassment of having one of your ministers as an bandit.
He basically extorted him into making him minister anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that now the thing is, it's interesting, because in the quotation that I told you about by Ishik, where he said that his master Hogyun wrote a story of Hong Gildong, he actually goes so far as to say that the reason we did that he was inspired by the Chinese work, The Water Margin, which is also known as The Outlaws of the Marsh, which is this massive 3,000-page epic about not one but like over 100 righteous outlaws, and that's one of the great novels of the Ming Dynasty, and it was known in Joseon Dynasty Korea, but whether they meant it or not, people tend to criticize it because it was such a disrespectful a novel that was so disrespectful of the law, of figures of authority, and so on, right? And so the claim was made that Hogyun loved that novel so much that he wanted to write a Korean version of it. And so he picked this one famous rebel, famous bandit, Hong Gildong, and wrote a novel. I mean, the problem is that there's just no evidence for that whatsoever.
Right. That is interesting. So I also want to ask not just about the bandit stories, but also the idea of class in stories. So one of the things that I find very fascinating in the Robin Hood tales is how in the early medieval ballads he's referenced as a yeoman. Then by the Elizabethan period, he's kind of made more acceptable to the noble classes by being turned into this distressed aristocrat. And then in the stories we have nowadays, it's kind of a coin flip about which version you even get.
Yeah.
Hollywood leans on the aristocrat version just because we like our noble heroes for whatever reason. And Hong Gildong is in this interesting place where he is this illegitimate son, which is a role that in the West is almost always a villain. You know, that idea of the bastard, like especially in earlier literature, they're like, that's a villain, you know, like right away. But he's clearly not the villain, he's clearly the hero. But even though he's illegitimate and is denied all these opportunities, he is still from this house that is the household of a high minister and has this wealthy upbringing where he has access to all of this ability to study these texts that give him magical powers. So I was kind of wondering where other figures are at in that sort of class strata in the stories coming from Korean literature that was being produced around the same time.
Right.
Are there illegitimate sons? Are they lower class, higher class? Kind of where are the heroes at?
Yeah. So before I go into it, because that's an excellent question, I just want to point out that, I mean, in order to write my book, I also did my sort of due diligence in other bandits, and especially Robin Hood. So I did some readings on the Robin Hood story. I just want to point out, there is one, I think, major difference between the way the Robin Hood story has been told versus the Hong Gildong story, right? I mean, in the case of Robin Hood, there is no one text. I mean, they're from all over I mean, they're just like, you know, I mean, so some of these like ballads and all that, they just deal with just a few episodes, right? There's not an original text that tells the entire story.
There's not a canonical Robin Hood, yeah.
Exactly, right? It's just, I mean, the study of Robin Hood literature is a study of many different versions and variants. And of course, you know, as you know much better than I, the standard story that people think that they know about him, that he's a partisan in the Norman-Saxon conflict during the time of King John, during the time of King Richard, before John became king, and so on. But that's much later. I mean, that's a really late development. Yep. I mean, I know that, for instance, the earlier version, there's a reference to a King Edward, which without being specifying which Edward it is. So that's, I mean, it's the story of Miriam and, you know, and other well-known figures that comes in later, and so on, right? So and there's good reason to believe that you know, a lot of that comes from folk tradition. But in the case of Hong Gildong, I do get really annoyed when even readers who appreciated my translation said this is a really excellent folktale from Korea, because for something to count as folktale, there has to be at least some kind of evidence of an oral tradition.
Right.
I'm not saying there wasn't. I'm just saying that there's no evidence for it. I mean, there's no. I mean, even if, because they're oral tradition, you know, they're not necessarily written down, but there's not a single record of somebody saying, I heard these peasants tell these stories, or I heard a storyteller. Not zero, right? And so what it is that, so unlike Robin Hood, where you're working with a whole variety of texts that were written over centuries, my contention is that the work known as Story of Hong Gildong did not exist prior to the 19th century. Some guy sat down, right? And there may have been some stories that he heard, and there may be some references to, you know, the real life bandit Hong Gildong, but he put this together. So it's much closer to what we now think of as a novel,
right?
You know, written by one specific writer, right? And there is, I mean, and I translated what is as close to an urtext as possible, which is not the case with Robin Hood. With Robin Hood, it's way more complicated than that, right? So it's. I mean, I would say they should, you know, despite the sort of some similar characteristics Robin Hood and Hong Gildong share with each other, the nature of the texts that they come out of are very, very different. Right? I mean, to get back to your class question, So one of the things that I love pointing out about 19th century Joseon Dynasty, in the context with which novels like this came out of, is that the 19th century was a time of crisis for Joseon Dynasty. It's one crisis after another, and the very social structure that the dynasty, which is one of the longest dynasties in the history of the world, it's over 500 years, it's slowly crumbling. And then in the last decades, it crumbles very quickly.
Right.
And so these novels came out of a time of crisis. And I think that's one of the reasons why the idea of an anti-authoritarian bandit hero could come out of that time period. So, and and also, like, for instance, and so you do get a lot of heroes from a variety of different backgrounds, Like, for instance, the single most famous type of popular novel, a popular story that can be described as a romance. Sometimes it's been, just as Hong Gildong has been described as the Korean Robin Hood. The story of Chunhyang has been described as the Korean Romeo and Juliet.
Okay.
And there, the hero, who's a heroine, is also an illegitimate child of a nobleman and a courtesan, right? A kisang, which is the Korean equivalent of geisha, right? A professional high-class prostitute, right? And it's about a romance between him and a legitimate son of a nobleman, and how they can't be together, and then they're together, and so on, right? So the two most famous Korean, pre-modern Korean stories are about illegitimate children.
Yeah, that is interesting.
I mean, it's totally interesting, and also, and so there's some stories here and there. So a lot, and there's a story about there's another love story that involves palace maidens. These are women who worked in the royal palace. But they're also like regular heroes, the kind of heroes that you expect: great generals, great statesmen, and so on. There's also a very interesting novel called The Story of Lady Bak. Story of Lady Bak. And the interesting thing about that story is that not only is the protagonist a woman, usually when women come up, they're usually like portrayed as sort of examples of virtuous behavior, modesty, and loyalty to their husband and all that. But she's the only person that I know who's a woman that I know from traditional literature who's also an action hero.
Yeah, not a lot of action hero women in the Story of Hong Gildong. They have very subdued powers.
Yeah. She has powers that are very similar to Hong Gildong's, and when the Manchus invade Korea, she uses them to defeat them, right? Very cool. Very cool. Unfortunately, it's Lady Bak. Unfortunately, it's not a very good, well-written story. It's
it's too bad.
Yeah, I mean, Hong Gildong is really well written, but this one is not good. But I love the idea of it. I love the story idea is really good. So what you got is you got outlaws, you got illegitimate children, you got women. To me, all of this is a sign of both the social crisis that Joseon Dynasty is going through, and also that leaving up a lot of opportunities, right? And the thing is, right now, I've just completed writing a chapter for a book of different scholarly articles on East Asia in the 18th century. And one of the things I'm pointing out is that 18th century was great for Korea. It was time of peace. It was time of prosperity. It had two kings, Yeongjo and Jeongjo, who were excellent monarchs, and things were just kind of ideal. And especially in the second half of the 18th century, the economy was doing so well that there was a great deal of social mobility. Sort of for the first time, you have lots of commoners who are getting wealthier and getting educated and so on. One of the interesting side effects of that is that all of a sudden, the rate of literacy in Korea shot up. And that made it possible for a commercial fiction industry to be created. Which just was not possible before then, because there was just not enough literate people, who could read books and enjoy them and had the spare time to enjoy reading books and so on. And it's in that context that you get novels like The Story of Hong Gildong. So what you get is that because of the economic opportunities that was created in the 18th century, it creates that kind of dynamic that makes that kind of literary production possible. And then you get into the 19th century where the kingdom is in crisis one after another. There's a lot of questions and issues that people want to work out through literature. And sometimes they get sort of these iconoclastic heroes and so on and so on. Now, one of the things I want to point out about the difference between the class system, the English Middle Ages and Joseon Dynasty, in Europe, your nobility comes from your blood.
Right.
So you could be an impoverished nobleman who made mistakes and you don't own anything anymore, but you're still a nobleman, right? You still get to be,
you get, titles.
And in Korea, the nobility, who are called the Yangban, is very different in the sense that although blood counts, it does matter a lot if you come from an illustrious family of Yangban. It is absolutely a requirement that you have to have people from your family who pass the civil service examination and gain a post in the government, right? Now it's interesting because like the word Yangban, which the Korean nobility, it literally means two directions or two orders. And the reason why it's called that is that there were two sets of examination that were offered by the government. One for civil service, and then after you pass it, that you begin at the lowest level of bureaucracy, and then you work your way up, and hopefully you can become a minister, like Hong Gildong's father. But you also had the military examinations, and if you pass that, you begin at the lower rank military officer, and you work your way up. Right now, even if you came from an illustrious Yangban family, if your sons are a bunch of morons and they just don't have the intelligence to pass the exam, and the exams were hard, right? No matter how illustrious your family, if it fails to produce an exam passer for like 2 or 3 generations, you are not a Yangban anymore, right? You have fallen, right? You're on your way to become commoners, right? If you thought that the life of like commoners was bad, life of like especially young boys in Yangban family was hellish because they are studying all damn day long, right? Since they were little kids. So what you get, but by law, through most of Joseon Dynasty, illegitimate children of noblemen were barred from taking the examinations. Right. That's the one major way in which you make your way in life, right? So Hong Gildong knows that he could easily pass either the civil or the service examination because he's so smart, but he's just barred from doing this, right? Yeah. But also it's interesting that the novel was written at a time when that entire system is falling apart, right? We know that the system has gotten increasingly corrupt. It's not producing the kind of leaders that Korea needed at the time. And by the time we get to the reform period in the very late 19th century, the entire system is scrapped, right? Because it was just completely defunct at that point.
Do you think because that system was sort of falling apart, that might have led to, say, that scene in the novel where he disguises himself as a student and goes to the monastery and says, hey, I am here to be in your monastery to study in peace and quiet for my civil service exams. But then he's just using that like as they're in for him and the bandits to rob the place.
Yeah. I can think about it like that, but yeah, I think that really makes sense, right? Because that a lot of young men did that. They still do it. High school students who are studying really hard for college entrance exam, they actually go to isolated places so they wouldn't get distracted by things. I know a novelist who does that. When it's time for him to write a novel, he just he leaves the city and goes into like and that's how a lot of Buddhist temples actually make their money. They have guest complexes for people to come, right? That's so insane, right? Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's definitely a parody of this young men trying to make their way by studying for those exams.
So do you think that it's that sort of combination of factors of the social disruption that was happening in the 19th century towards the end of the dynasty, and that the increased literacy amongst the populace, and then also just it being a well-written book, that sort of that kind of trifecta of things that helped lead to the book's popularity?
Yes, but there's a kind of but there, right? I've also completed an article that I sent. There's a really big project, I think, that's going to come out of University of Oxford Press, where the editor is putting together a volume of national epics. So they found scholars from as many different who specialize in as many different countries as possible, and asked them to write about the great national epic of each country, right? And it's going to have over 100 chapters.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a very cool. It's a very, very cool project, and
Yeah.
I submitted one on the Story of Hong Gildong, but with a specific angle that. Yes, during the 19th century and early part of the 20th century, there is ample evidence that I could point to that shows that it was a popular work, right? You know, as I said, a work gets published, and then if it becomes successful, rival printers would just get it and,
Right.
you know, print more stuff, right? And so we know that the ones that have the most copies that have survived, especially in different variants, we can reasonably expect to gauge how popular a work was by seeing how many, you know, different variants of it existed, right?
Sure.
So that means, I mean, just looking at that, the Story of Hong Gildong was a success. But I'd say during the Joseon Dynasty, it wasn't a runaway success, right? I mean, it wasn't a blockbuster box office success. It was like a mid-level good success, right?
Okay.
Why? Because there are other works that have like 10 times the kind of variants that still exists, right? For instance, there's what scholars think is the single most popular Korean novel, may have been a work called The Story of Cho-eung, which a good translation of that also exists. And we have, you know, I mean, 10 times more variant text of that than we do of Story of Hong Gildong. So that means it was 10 times more popular, right? But what happened is that it was in the 20th century that Story of Hong Gildong got picked up and became the national epic, right?
Okay.
It got picked up because people made movies of it, people made dramas of it, they wrote modern novelistic versions of it, and so on, right? And it became a national epic in the 20th century, not in the Joseon Dynasty. So a moderately successful book became the, you know, representative text of, you know, of Korea in the 20th century, and I had to analyze why. You know, why did this? And first of all, there's a good reason why the Story of Cho-eung, which was way more popular, could never ever fulfill that role of a national epic. It's because it takes place in China.
Yeah.
And all the characters are Chinese characters, right? Which is fairly normal for Korea, because in Korean culture during the Joseon Dynasty, you know, China was still seen as the center of civilization, was a fount of civilization. So that would not have been as unusual as, say, a Renaissance English writer writing a novel or a play that takes place in ancient Greece or Rome. Right, and because that's where, you know, Western civilization is sort
it's
of
all linked to it. Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. And there's a lot of allusions to, even in the Story of Hong Gildong, which, you know, takes place in Korea, there's still a lot of references to famous figures from Chinese history, famous generals, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like for instance, I mean, it wouldn't be as unusual at all if in like a medieval English literature, somebody's military prowess is described as that of Alexander the Great.
Right. Very similar.
Right. Or she's as beautiful as Aphrodite. Or, you know, I mean, you know, these are ancient figures, but that's fine. But in the 20th century, when there was a need to point to a work as sort of a point of national pride, nationalism is now involved. Right? So you can't do that with a work about Chinese. But where's the Story of Hong Gildong? That takes place in Korea, and it's the best written adventure, empowering, you know, story about a great hero who's Korean, right? And that's what ends up launching him to that. And you know what's interesting is that today, if you stop any Korean, nobody has even heard of the Story of Cho-eung.
Yeah.
I mean, the single most popular work of fiction from the Joseon Dynasty, it is completely forgotten now.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so if you go to Korea and you like stop anybody and say, "Tell me about Hong Gildong," they'll be able to tell you a lot about it.
Yeah.
But Jorong, who knows? I mean, nobody knows.
Interesting. Interesting. That is, it is so fascinating how mercurial those incredibly popular works can become, more than we expect, even the ones that get copied a lot like that. That does lead into a question I wanted to make sure to ask you, though, because I usually end the interviews asking the guests to tell me what one of their favorite adaptations of Robin Hood is. So I would like to know, given that there were all these adaptations of Hong Gildong that helped popularize it, what is your favorite adaptation of the story of Hong Gildong?
Okay, so the entirety of the second part of my book is about different adaptations, right? I don't, that's a really difficult question because I analyzed as many of them that I could find, except that I never thought in terms of which one do I like the best, because they all have different kind of different kind of adventure and this of it. Like for instance, the North Korean Hong Gildong one is utterly fascinating because you can see people trying to do this story, infuse it with communist ideology and so on. And I'll just tell you one thing about that movie that's totally interesting. So it goes on the way it is in the beginning. I can't call my father, blah, blah. Yeah. And then at the end, Hong Gildong is doing his thing, and then the story takes a wild, weird turn where there's this other group of criminals who are like kidnapping women and they're stealing treasures from the royal palace. So Hong Gildong has to team up with his half brother, who's a government official, in order to figure out who these criminals are and stop them. And you know who they end up being? Japanese ninjas. Now, if you know anything about North Korean propaganda, I mean, this is so North Korean, right? Because of course it's going to be the Japanese, right? I mean,
right.
So the last part of the movie is Hong Gildong battling ninjas from Japan who are trying to steal women from right? Okay, but I'll tell you one. So there was in 2008. There was a brand new kind of a fun version of Hong Gildong that came on in South Korean TV. It was called Kwedo Hong Gildong, the Hong Gildong, the Sharp Blade. And what that one was that they decided to sort of do the Hong Gildong story with a lot of cool, young, like young, hip sensibility, right? I mean, and it's filled with fun anachronism. Hong Gildong shows up wearing sunglasses. There's pop music and rap music in the background, and it's got very beautiful young people, doing all kinds of things and all that.
That sounds very mid 2000s. There was a very like hip, young, and very anachronistic Robin Hood that the BBC was doing at the same time.
Yeah, and also what's cool about it also is that at the end, the story comes to an end, and then there's a narration at the end that says that Hong Gildong, the great hero of the past, may be gone, but his spirit still lives on. And it ends with the shot of the top of a skyscraper in modern Seoul, and there's Hong Gildong standing on top of it, dressed fully in red, which struck me because that's the color of revolution. Mm-hmm. And the narration something like, so that the corrupt, wealthy, and the powerful should never feel safe as long as that spirit of Hong Gildong is still alive. I go, whoa, that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
So that one was a lot of fun.
Was that a film or a television series?
Oh, it was a TV show.
Okay, Hong Gildong, the Sharp Blade. I might have to see if I can dig that up. That sounds fun.
Yeah.
Do you happen to have a favorite Robin Hood adaptation?
Oh, yeah. I do like. No, I can't think of it. I did not like the recent film. That was silly. I did not like the Russell Crowe one. I prefer those like the more ideologically oriented one where he's seen more as a commoner's hero.
Yeah.
Those are much fun. I tell you, that was like. It's an example that I use all the time with my students. It's a really, really funny anachronism. Remember that Patrick Bergen one?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
The other
there's a
one from 1991. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, there's a hilarious scene where King John was played by Edward Fox. I think it was Edward, one of the Fox brothers. I can never tell those two, apart, right?
Me neither.
And he said something like, I mean, it's just a funny line. He said something like, "We got to bring this Hong Gildong guy, person down, otherwise he could endanger the whole feudal order." And I laughed so hard. It's like, there's a medieval king who has an idea of what a feudal order is. It's like, you know, I mean, to him, that's just the way the world is. There isn't a name for the feudal order, right? The concept of feudalism just does not rise at all.
No, that was definitely the age of, there was a divine order of the world, and it was not questioned. That was just how
it exactly worked.
It was our system of government that we have consciously put into place.
Right, yeah. To order a war that's not going to be coined for another 300 years, right? I love that.
Well, thank you so much. I want to just be, aware of your time, and I appreciate how much time you've been giving me. And you mentioned that you've been really busy right now because you've had a book launch. You just had a novel. Yeah. So you want to tell us a little bit about your novel before we go?
Oh, yeah, sure. Arc, Melancholy of Untold History. I mean, I've been wanting to write. I've been writing fiction. I've been publishing short stories for a long time, but this is my debut novel. It brings together my two interests. One is obviously history, and the other is speculative fiction. And I want to write a novel to illustrate a historical idea that I've been telling my students for years, which is that, this, interesting enough, it applies to both Robin Hood and Hong Gildong. When any civilization tells stories about itself, who we are, it begins with stories of gods and monsters and semi-divine heroes. But when that civilization develops, it doesn't stop telling stories about gods and heroes, but more and more its interest shifts toward telling historical stories, especially about the great personages, kings and generals and sages, so on, right? So it moves from myth to history. But when that civilization enters into a modern era, interest goes increasingly toward the lives of the common people. It's everyday citizens, including their inner thoughts and feelings and so on, right? So, so this tripartite movement. I mean, they don't stop telling stories of gods and historical figures, but this is the extra. This is the new kind of thing that they tell. So this is movement from myth to history to everyday life. And I wanted to illustrate that movement, but for various different reasons, I do not write traditional historical novels because it doesn't give me the kind of free imaginative play that I love in writing fiction. So what I did was I created an entire fictional Asian country, and through episodes that are 1,000 years apart, I interchange between stories about its myths to stories about its history. And then in terms of the real life, it's a story about a modern day historian, a history professor, who's studying both the myths and the history.
I love that. That sounds great. Is it available for pre-order now?
Yes, it is. It's on Amazon. And even I don't think they did the audio version yet, but even that's available for pre-order.
Oh, fantastic. Well, congratulations on
Thank you so much.
Its imminent release. I hope it does really well for you.
Thank you.
Thanks again so much for joining me. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me. It was really a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, I loved it. Thank you so much.
All right, great. Thank you.
Bye.
My thanks again to Minsoo Kang for joining me to discuss the figure of Hong Gildong and help provide some insights about the background of this tremendously popular work and its meteoric rise in Korean culture. You can find links to his work on Hong Gildong and to his new novel in the episode description. If you've read The Story of Hong Gildong or seen one of its many adaptations, please get in touch to let me know your thoughts. And if there's another noble bandit figure from elsewhere in the world you'd also like to see covered, I'd love to hear about it. You can find Into the Greenwood on most of the major social media platforms, including the site formerly known as Twitter, as well as Threads, Blue Sky, Instagram, and Facebook, all with the handle @IntoGreenwood. You can also reach out directly via email with the address intogreenwood@gmail.com. In addition, Into the Greenwood is active on a Discord server for all things Robin Hood related, run by friend of the show, Mike Nichols. If you'd like to join that Discord community where we source questions, organize watch parties, play games, have a book club, and just generally engage in friendly discussion, then reach out over email or social media to get an invitation. Into the Greenwood is supported by our amazing and generous followers on Patreon. At patreon.com/IntoGreenwood, you can follow for absolutely free or contribute as little as $1 a month to help pay for our hosting fees. Patrons at the Merry Bandit and Notorious Outlaw levels also get bonus content that can include extended interview segments and other special exclusives. If you're willing to make a small one-time contribution towards keeping Into the Greenwood on the air, we also have an account on buymeacoffee.com/IntoGreenwood. We just got our first tip from Buy Me a Coffee, and I have to admit that I teared up a little. It takes many hours to arrange, record, and edit every episode, and right now we're barely covering our hosting fees. Whether it's $1 a month on Patreon or a single tip through Buy Me a Coffee, I can't stress enough how much those contributions matter. However, since this whole project is inspired by a forest hero who has become associated with charitable work, no matter how much or how little is contributed to keeping this podcast running, a minimum of 10% of all proceeds will be donated to a select charity. At this time, that charity remains Trees, Water, and People, a top-rated charity dedicated to establishing sustainable access to food and clean water for impoverished communities around the world. If you're feeling a bit impoverished yourself, a positive rating or review, or just sharing a favorite episode or two would do wonders for helping others to find the show. As a small, independent podcast amid thousands of options out there, it's a real challenge for our little show to break through and gain listeners. So every single rating or share makes a significant impact. Into the Greenwood is produced and edited by me, Thaddeus Papke. Our theme music is by Plastic 3. That's all for now, though. So once again, I find myself wishing safe travels to you, one and all, until our next journey together into the Greenwood.